My name is Naama Rodriguez. I am 32 years old and I underwrite commercial loans in Kansas City, Missouri. I calculate risk for a living. I spend my days evaluating liabilities, identifying structural weaknesses in portfolios, and predicting defaults before they materialize. Numbers never lie, and they never hold grudges. People require a different metric. The greatest blind spot in my lifelong risk assessment had been sitting right in front of me for 24 years, my own family. I arrived in the Rodriguez household as an 8-year-old foster child. 4 years later, David and Helen produced their biological miracle, Isabella. From that moment, the hierarchy hardened into permanent law. Tonight, the Plaza Pavilion smelled of imported white lilies and seared Wagyu. The vaulted limestone ceilings amplified the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the low hum of local elite. I stood near the back of the reception hall, quietly adjusting a wilting stem in a centerpiece. It was a habit of mine fixing small things no one else noticed. I had paid for those lilies. I had funded the catering, the floral arches, and the premium open bar. $35,000 wired directly from my savings account to the venue, ensuring my sister had the flawless day my mother insisted she deserved. The jazz band faded, replaced by the sharp tapping of a butter knife against a glass. Isabella stood at the head table, her veil pushed back, cheeks flushed with champagne and triumph. She leaned into the microphone. The room quieted. Expectant smiles spread across the faces of our relatives. "I want to thank you all for being here," Isabella began, her voice echoing off the walls. "I am so glad my real family is here today." I stopped touching the centerpiece. Isabella locked eyes with me across the room, her smile thinned into a razor edge. Growing up, we always tried to be inclusive. Naama was a charity case my parents took in out of the goodness of their hearts. We tried to make her fit, but she was never really family. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Then the scraping of chairs broke the quiet. David and Helen stood up from their seats next to the bride. They smiled. My mother brought her hands together. My father followed. They clapped. Within seconds, a wave of polite, hesitant applause rippled through the guests. I did not flush. I did not shed a tear. You do not panic when an investment goes to zero. You cut your losses and liquidate. A man in a dark suit stepped into my peripheral vision. He was the head of event security, a contractor I had personally signed the check for that morning. He placed a heavy hand on my elbow. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to leave," he muttered, carefully avoiding my gaze. Welcome to Morning Revenge, where quiet people finally close the ledger on family secrets and the loudest voices learn what silence has been keeping track of. If you have ever paid the price to sit at a table where you were not wanted, you are in the right place. Drop a comment below telling me your age and where you are listening from, and make sure to subscribe. You will want to be here when the groom finds the receipts. I smoothed the lapels of my blazer. I walked out under the gaze of 100 people I had known for 2 decades. The heavy oak doors of the pavilion shut behind me. The cool evening air hit my face as I crossed the gravel parking lot toward my car. My fingers brushed the door handle. Inside the venue, the music abruptly cut off. A harsh burst of static feedback screeched over the outdoor speakers. Then came a groom's voice. Lucas did not yell, but the cold edge in his tone carried perfectly through the sound system. "Where did she go?" The cool autumn air stung my cheeks as I crossed the gravel lot. Each step away from the Plaza Pavilion felt like closing a bad account. I pressed my thumb against the unlock sensor of my sedan. The headlights flashed briefly, illuminating the manicured hedges lining the property. I reached for the handle. Behind me, the heavy brass hinges of the venue doors groaned. A rectangle of warm yellow light spilled across the pavement, cutting through the shadows. I turned my head. Lucas walked through that light. He did not jog. He did not wave his arms. A man running implies panic, and Lucas does not panic. He calculates. He stepped onto the gravel, the crisp lines of his tailored tuxedo cutting a sharp silhouette against the glowing entrance. His jacket hung open. His silk bow tie dangled untied around his collar. In his right hand, he carried a thick navy blue leather portfolio. He closed the distance between us, his leather dress shoes echoing in the quiet night. He stopped 3 feet from my bumper. He was breathing steadily, but his jaw muscles flexed tight and rigid beneath his skin. "Naama," he said. The tone held no romantic desperation. It held the precise, measured curiosity of an auditor finding a glaring discrepancy. I lowered my hand from the car door. I looked at the portfolio. I recognized the gold-embossed logo of the Plaza Pavilion on the cover. It was the master event ledger, the centralized binder the venue management uses to track every vendor rider, insurance certificate, and payment receipt for a given evening. Lucas opened the binder. He flipped past the catering menus and the floral arrangements. He stopped on a thick sheet of legal paper. "Why is your name listed as the sole financial guarantor on the master lease agreement for this venue?" he asked. The question hung in the brisk air. I studied his face. Lucas is a forensic accountant. He spends his working hours at a downtown private equity firm dissecting corporate tax shelters, tracing hidden offshore assets, and unraveling complex embezzlement schemes. He is paid a very high salary to notice when the numbers do not reconcile. Isabella had always been meticulous about the narrative she fed him. Over their 2-year courtship, she had painted our father, David, as a stoic, self-made Midwestern businessman. The local hardware store David owned was framed as a highly profitable pillar of the community, an enterprise that provided a seamless, affluent lifestyle. Isabella had cast herself as the grounded, modest daughter of that success. To explain my presence, she told Lucas that my parents took me in as a foster child because I had nowhere else to go. She claimed I harbored a deep simmering resentment toward her for being the biological favorite. She insisted she only invited me tonight out of a sense of charitable obligation. Most importantly, she had explicitly told Lucas that David and Helen were covering the entire cost of the pavilion as a traditional proud gift to their youngest child. She wanted Lucas to believe she came from wealth, matching his own financial status without appearing entitled. "Where did you find the venue dossier, Lucas?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. He looked down at the documents, his thumb tracing the ink on the page. "I went back to the bridal suite during the toast. I needed to grab the leather journal where I wrote my vows. The suite was empty. The event coordinator had left her clipboard and the finalized contract on the vanity right next to Isabella's makeup bag." He took a half-step closer, angling the folder so the ambient light from a nearby street lamp illuminated the crisp white pages. "I saw the wire transfer receipts," he continued his pitch, shifting from curious to clinical. $35,000. The originating routing number belongs to a local credit union. I recognize the institution. The account holder listed on the transfer is Naama Rodriguez, not David, not Helen. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto mine. The forensic accountant was processing the raw data. He knew David's business model. He understood the standard profit margins of a local hardware supply. The economic narrative Isabella had constructed was disintegrating right there on the pavement. "You paid for all of this," Lucas stated. It was not a question. It was a verified finding. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. A few moments ago, inside the ballroom, the conflict had been a simple social humiliation, a mean sister embarrassing the outcast sibling. Now, under the harsh light of the parking lot lamps, the conflict mutated into severe financial deception. Lucas realized his bride had lied about the fundamental economics of their wedding day, and by extension, the financial reality of her entire family. Before I could confirm his findings, the pavilion doors crashed open a second time. Isabella burst into the night air. Her ivory silk gown rustled loudly against the concrete steps. She had discarded her bouquet. Her veil caught the autumn wind whipping around her shoulders like a fractured halo. She marched down the steps, the gravel snapping sharply under her satin heels. "Lucas!" she shrieked. The sound sliced through the quiet night, carrying a frantic, unhinged quality. She inserted herself between us, her chest heaving, eyes wide and desperate. The flush of champagne had vanished, replaced by a pale, panicked sheen. She grabbed his forearm, her manicured nails digging into the dark wool of his tuxedo sleeve. "What are you doing out here with her?" Isabella demanded. Her voice trembled with the calibrated mixture of hurt and outrage. She turned her glare toward me, her teeth bared. "Are you really this desperate, Naama? You could not stand seeing me happy? You tried to ruin my toast, and now you are out here trying to steal my groom." It was a masterful performance. If I were a casual observer, I might have felt a twinge of sympathy for the distressed bride. But I am an underwriter. I look at the balance sheet. I see the deficits. Her projection was a standard defense mechanism designed to obscure her own liability. Lucas did not comfort her. He did not wrap his arms around her trembling shoulders. He did not offer soft words of reassurance. Instead, he slowly pried her fingers off his sleeve, peeling her hand away, as if removing a static cling. He held up the open leather folder. He angled it deliberately so the street lamp illuminated the wire transfer receipts, placing the undeniable proof directly in her line of sight. Isabella looked at the paper. The practiced outrage on her face faltered. Her jaw slackened just for a fraction of a second. The mask slipped. Then she scrambled to rebuild her defenses, her mind racing to construct a new lie. "Lucas, honey, I can explain that," she stammered, the pitch of her voice climbing higher. "Naama offered to help with some minor vendor deposits. She is just trying to twist the paperwork to make herself look like a victim. You know how she gets. She is always trying to make everything about her." I looked at the woman who had shared a bathroom with me for a decade. I looked at the sister who had just stood on a stage and declared to a room full of people that I was a charity case. I felt no urge to shout. I felt no desire to pull her hair or engage in a screaming match on the gravel. The transaction was over. The debt was canceled. I met Isabella's panicked gaze. "I did not steal anything," I said, my voice cutting through the cool air like a scalpel. "I bought it." I turned my back on the bride and the groom. I pulled the handle of my car door, the heavy metal yielding with a solid click. I slid into the driver's seat and pressed the ignition button. The engine hummed to life, a steady, reliable vibration beneath my hands. Through the windshield, I watched Lucas close the leather folder. He did not look at Isabella. He turned on his heel and walked back toward the pavilion, leaving his bride standing alone in the parking lot, the wind tearing at her veil. I shifted the car into drive and pressed the accelerator. The tires crunched over the gravel as I exited the pavilion grounds, merging onto the quiet, tree-lined avenue. The interior of my car was silent, save for the rhythmic passing of streetlights overhead. I took a deep, steadying breath. The worst was over. I had cut the toxic asset from my portfolio. I was ready to go home, pour a glass of bourbon, and begin the quiet process of moving on. Then, the digital console in my dashboard illuminated, casting a harsh blue glow across the leather steering wheel. My phone, resting in the cup holder, buzzed with a long, sustained vibration. I glanced down at the screen. It was not a text message from a concerned relative. It was not an apology from David or Helen. It was an automated fraud alert from First Missouri Bank. The text glowed bright against the dark interior of the cabin. A withdrawal request had just triggered a critical security threshold. Someone was currently attempting to process a $15,000 transaction from an account bearing my name. My pulse, which had remained steady through the entire public humiliation, spiked. The arithmetic of the night was wrong. The family had not just cut me out, they were actively emptying the vault. The blue light from the dashboard console painted my hands, casting a harsh glow inside the quiet cabin of my sedan. I stared at the digital display. First Missouri Bank Fraud Prevention. Transaction alert. Amount $15,000. Status pending approval. My foot eased off the accelerator. I guided my vehicle toward the shoulder of the road, shifting the gear into park. The engine idled softly. I read the notification again. My pulse did not race. Instead, a cold, clinical clarity settled over me. This was a targeted strike. Someone was attempting to pull funds I had not authorized mere minutes after I had been exiled from the Plaza Pavilion. To comprehend the architecture of the trap closing around me, you have to understand the $35,000 wire transfer. You have to understand the specific flavor of guilt cultivated in a child who is reminded every single day that her presence is a charitable act. 6 months prior to this night, Helen had appeared at my front door unannounced. She stepped into my home wearing her crisp, tailored slacks, holding her designer handbag tight against her ribs. She sat at my kitchen island. I poured her a cup of black coffee. She did not drink it. Instead, she folded a paper napkin into tiny, precise squares, her hands trembling. Then the tears started. My mother is not a woman who cries over burnt dinner or sad movies. Her tears are strategic. She looked at me, her eyes brimming, and laid out a story of financial ruin. David's hardware store, the cornerstone of their suburban identity, was supposedly drowning in debt. Big box retailers had squeezed their margins. Supply chain issues had drained their reserves. Helen wept, claiming the bank was threatening to call their business loans. Then came the pivot. Isabella's wedding was rapidly approaching. Helen gripped her coffee mug and whispered that they could no longer afford the deposits for the reception. She painted a vivid picture of the shame David would endure if he had to cancel his youngest daughter's dream event. He would lose face in the community. His pride would shatter. I am a commercial loan underwriter. My entire career is built on verifying claims. When a business owner sits across my desk and asks for capital, I demand 3 years of audited tax returns. I pull credit histories. I scrutinize profit and loss statements. I look for hidden liabilities and structural rot. But Helen did not sit across a mahogany desk. She sat in my kitchen, weeping into a napkin. She looked at the 8-year-old foster child she had taken in 24 years ago. I had arrived at their house with my belongings in a black plastic bag. They gave me a room, a surname, and an education. I had spent my entire adult life trying to balance that invisible ledger. I did not ask for David's tax returns. I ignored every professional instinct I possessed. I saw a moral debt demanding repayment. The next morning, I logged into my banking portal. I authorized a direct wire transfer to the Plaza Pavilion Management Group, $35,000, effectively wiping out the bulk of my liquid savings. I considered it the final installment on my gratitude. I thought the transaction bought my permanent place at their table. I was wrong. The transaction simply proved I was a reliable mark. I pulled my car back onto the road and drove the remaining 2 miles to my neighborhood. I navigated the dark streets, pulling into my concrete driveway. I turned off the ignition. The silence of the cabin pressed in on me. I stared at the fraud alert still glowing on my screen, debating whether to call the bank's emergency line. Before I could dial, my phone vibrated with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed an unknown Kansas City number. I swiped the screen and brought the speaker to my ear. I expected David, ready to unleash a tirade about my lack of decorum. I expected Isabella screaming about the ruined atmosphere. Nama. The voice was deep, steady, and exhausted. It was Lucas. "Lucas," I replied, keeping my tone neutral, "you should be inside. Your guests are waiting." "There is no reception," he stated. The line crackled faintly. "I canceled the catering. I spoke to the venue manager and the band. I told everyone to go home. Isabella is currently in the bridal suite with her bridesmaids trying to figure out how to spin this on social media. I left the building." I sat back against my leather seat. The sheer efficiency of his decision was staggering. Lucas had not caused a scene. He had simply looked at the fraudulent data, assessed the character of the woman he was about to marry, and terminated the arrangement. "I am sorry your wedding ended this way," I said. I meant it. Lucas was collateral damage in a war he did not even know he was fighting. "Do not apologize," Lucas replied. His breathing was audible through the speaker. "You are not the one who lied to me, but you need to know the rest of it. You need to know exactly what your parents did." I waited. The digital clock on my dashboard read 10:45. "After we spoke in the parking lot," Lucas continued, "I realized Isabella had fabricated her entire financial background. If she lied about the venue, she lied about the foundation. I am an accountant, Nama. I verify everything. Before the wedding, when David was boasting about his hardware store, I ran a routine background check on his business entities. It is a habit. I just wanted to understand the family portfolio I was marrying into." My grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What did you find?" "The hardware store was never facing bankruptcy," Lucas said, his words sharp and deliberate. "The operating cash flow was stable, but the inventory is not the real asset. The real asset is the land. The store sits on 3 acres of prime commercial real estate near the new highway expansion. David did not lose the business. He cashed out." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. "What do you mean?" "3 months ago, David finalized a sale of that land to a commercial developer," Lucas explained. "I pulled the county property records. The transaction is public if you know where to look. He sold the real estate for $1.2 million. He leased the storefront back for a year just to keep up appearances, but he is sitting on a mountain of liquid cash." The street lamp outside my windshield flickered. The cold reality of his words washed over me. 6 months ago, Helen had wept in my kitchen. She had claimed they were destitute. She had leveraged my profound unspoken guilt as an adopted child to extract $35,000 from my savings. But they had not been desperate. They had been finalizing a 7-figure real estate deal. They did not need my money to pay for Isabella's event. They simply preferred to spend my money rather than touch their own newly acquired wealth. They had orchestrated an elaborate theatrical performance to drain my resources, treating me not as a daughter, but as a supplementary bank account. "They have over $1 million in the bank, Naama," Lucas said softly. "They used you." "I know," I answered. My voice did not shake. The betrayal was profound, but it clarified everything. The fog of familial obligation evaporated, leaving behind a stark, unforgiving balance sheet. "I need to go," Lucas said. "I have to contact my lawyers in the morning to annul the marriage certificate. Keep your guard up." The line went dead. I lowered the phone to my lap. The fraud alert for $15,000 was still glaring on the screen. The timeline snapped into brutal focus. I had just been publicly expelled from the family. The ties were officially severed. Yet, at this exact moment, someone was attempting a devastating withdrawal. They were not satisfied with the wedding money. Knowing I was now an exiled asset, they were making a final, coordinated run on my accounts. They intended to take everything I had left before I could lock the doors. I opened my banking application. I needed to see exactly which account had been targeted. I needed to see the origin of the strike. The new conflict was no longer a matter of emotional betrayal. I was facing an active, calculated financial assault. The dashboard console cast a harsh blue light over my hands. I stared at the digital display, my breathing shallow and measured. First Missouri Bank Fraud Prevention. Transaction alert. Amount, $15,000. Status, pending approval. I tapped the banking application icon on my screen. The biometric scanner read my face and unlocked the secure digital vault. I bypassed my primary checking and high-yield savings portfolios. I needed to isolate the origin point of the withdrawal. I scrolled down to the archived accounts section. The ledger loaded, spinning a small circle before rendering the data. The request was not targeting my active funds. It was drawn against a dormant custodial account. When I first entered the foster system at 8 years old, the state of Missouri established a modest trust to cover basic living expenses. When David and Helen became my legal guardians, the court granted them administrative access to those funds. I had always assumed the balance was drained decades ago to pay for my middle school braces, winter coats, and generic school supplies. I had not thought about that specific routing number since I was a teenager. The state officially closed the custodial mandate when I turned 18, supposedly transferring sole ownership to me. Yet here the account sat, alive and actively bleeding cash. Someone had initiated a cashier check request using the legacy routing information. I pressed the red emergency freeze icon. The system processed the command. A confirmation message appeared, locking the remaining funds in digital amber. I leaned my head back against the leather headrest. The sheer nerve of the maneuver settled deep in my stomach, forming a cold, heavy knot. My parents were not merely punishing me for a ruined toast. They had planned this financial extraction well in advance. The sunrise brought daylight, but it provided no warmth. I stood in my bathroom, methodically applying my makeup. I wrapped myself in a charcoal wool suit, my professional armor, and drove toward the financial district. First Missouri Bank occupied a brutalist concrete building on Walnut Street. The lobby smelled of lemon floor polish and cold circulated air. I did not take a paper ticket. I did not wait in the standard teller queue. I walked directly past the velvet ropes toward the glass-partitioned office of the branch manager. His name was Thomas, and I dealt with him regularly during complex commercial loan closures. Thomas looked up from his monitor. He stood smoothing his silk tie. "Naama," he said, offering a polite smile. "You are in the branch early. Do we have a corporate closing scheduled for this morning?" "I need a physical hard copy of a withdrawal slip, Thomas," I said, my voice entirely flat. "Attempted last night at 10:40. Account ending in 429. Someone tried to pull $15,000 via a cashier check." Thomas frowned. The polite smile vanished, replaced by professional concern. He sat back down and clicked his mouse several times, navigating the internal security portal. The laser printer on his credenza whirred to life. He retrieved the warm paper and slid it across his polished mahogany desk. I picked up the photocopy. The slip was filled out in blue ink. The requested payee was a limited liability holding company I did not recognize, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. The looping cursive letters, the sharp, aggressive angle of the signature block. It was not Isabella. The ink belonged to Helen. My mother had walked into a suburban branch yesterday afternoon. She had likely visited the bank right before her hair and makeup appointment for the wedding. She presented herself as the sole administrator of a child custodial trust. She used my Social Security number. She forged my signature on the secondary authorization line. She committed a federal crime while her biological daughter was stepping into an expensive ivory gown I had paid for. I thanked Thomas, folded the photocopy into perfect thirds, and slid it into my briefcase. I walked out of the bank. The morning commuter traffic hummed along the downtown pavement. The crisp autumn wind tugged at my lapels, but I felt entirely numb. This situation had escalated far beyond a domestic dispute over a seating chart or a broken engagement. This was acute, calculated identity theft. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I needed to map the fastest route to the Central Police Precinct. I had to file an official criminal report before Helen could attempt another withdrawal at a different banking institution. As I typed the precinct address into the search bar, a text message notification dropped down from the top edge of my screen. The sender was Isabella. I opened the message thread. There was no apology for the parking lot confrontation. There was no mention of Lucas, the canceled reception, or the missing groom. The message contained a singular, venomous sentence. "You embarrassed us, so we are taking back what you owe us." I stared at the glowing pixels, reading the words twice. The absolute entitlement of the statement was breathtaking. In their minds, my money was not my property. It was their deferred compensation. I owed them for the roof they provided 24 years ago. I owed them for the food I ate as a foster child. The $35,000 wedding wire was just a preliminary down payment on my existence. The machine of their resentment was fully operational. They were not just cutting me out of family photos. They were systematically attempting to liquidate my life. I needed a detective, but a quick glance at my wristwatch told me I had an urgent underwriting committee meeting starting in exactly 20 minutes. In the commercial lending sector, you do not miss a committee meeting unless you are hospitalized. I made a tactical decision. I would head to my office building, finalize my morning portfolio approvals, and use my lunch hour to visit the police precinct. I needed my professional reputation securely in place before I waged a legal war against my own parents. I parked my sedan in the subterranean corporate garage. I rode the elevator to the 14th floor. The lending floor was a symphony of clicking keyboards, humming printers, and hushed telephone conversations. I walked straight to my cubicle, set my briefcase down on the floor, and booted up my dual monitors. I took a deep breath, preparing to compartmentalize the family trauma. Before the operating system even finished loading its startup sequence, a shadow fell across my keyboard. I looked up. Marcus, the senior managing director of our commercial real estate division, stood towering over my desk. Marcus was a man who rarely left his corner office unless millions of dollars were in immediate jeopardy. He held a thick, sealed manila folder in his left hand. His facial expression was unreadable, a blank slate that triggered a sudden spike in my adrenaline. "Neama," Marcus said. He dropped his voice low enough to prevent the neighboring financial analysts from eavesdropping. "My office, right now." I stood up, abandoning my computer. I followed him across the carpeted floor, tracing the path to the executive suite. He ushered me inside and closed the heavy glass door behind us. The sudden quiet of the soundproof room was deafening. Marcus walked behind his large desk, but he did not sit in his chair. He tossed the manila folder onto the center of his leather blotter. It slid across the smooth surface and stopped inches from my hands. "I received a priority courier package this morning delivered straight to the executive mailroom." Marcus began, folding his arms tightly across his chest. It contained a commercial bridge loan application, $5 million. The applicant is seeking immediate, expedited approval to leverage a suburban retail development project. "We process high-yield bridge loans every single day, Marcus," I replied. I kept my posture rigid, refusing to show the sudden anxiety gripping my chest. "Why are you personally showing this specific file to me?" "Because of the guarantor listed on the documents," he said. I reached out and opened the folder. The top page was a standard corporate intake form. The borrowing entity was a newly formed limited liability company. It was the exact same obscure company name I had just seen written in Helen blue cursive on the forged bank withdrawal slip 30 minutes ago. My eyes quickly scanned down to the collateral section. The applicant was using the $1.2 million of liquid cash from David's secret hardware store real estate sale as the primary equity injection. The arithmetic was making terrifying sense. David and Helen were attempting to parlay their newfound hidden wealth into a highly leveraged commercial development deal. But the collateral was not the problem. The problem was located at the absolute bottom of the page, directly under the authorization clause. "Look at the underwriter of record," Marcus instructed. His tone turned dangerously sharp, stripping away any professional warmth. I looked at the signature line. My full legal name, Naima Rodriguez, was printed in bold black letters. Directly above the printed name was my digital authorization stamp, a highly secure internal credential code, strictly issued by the firm. Next to the stamp was my forged signature guaranteeing the integrity of the $5 million request. My family was not just trying to steal my personal cash. They had somehow compromised my corporate identity to fast-track a multi-million-dollar fraudulent loan through my own employer, risking my freedom and my entire career in the process. I stared at the forged signature on the $5 million bridge loan application. Marcus stood perfectly still, waiting for my explanation. The air in his soundproof office felt heavy and stagnant. I did not panic. I leaned closer to the document and traced the digital authorization stamp with my index finger. I checked the timestamp printed in the bottom corner. The authorization was logged on Saturday night at 8:15. I looked up at Marcus. I told him that at 8:15 on Saturday night I was standing in the gravel parking lot of the Plaza Pavilion, getting screamed at by a bride. I told him I had a venue security guard, 100 wealthy guests, and the groom himself as immediate alibis. Furthermore, the internet protocol address attached to the digital stamp would trace back to my home desktop computer, not my secure corporate laptop. Someone had entered my house while I was at the wedding, booted up my personal machine, and used my saved credentials to push the fraudulent loan through the initial approval phase. Marcus exhaled a long breath. The rigid tension in his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. He pulled the manila folder away from my hands. He believed me, but in the commercial banking industry, being a victim of targeted fraud still makes you a severe operational risk. He suspended the bridge loan immediately and instructed me to change every password I possessed. The immediate corporate crisis was averted, but the underlying message was terrifyingly clear. My family had keys to my home, unrestricted access to my data, and absolutely zero moral boundaries. I spent Monday changing the deadbolts on my front door and securing a formal police report for the bank withdrawal slip Helen had forged. I thought I had erected enough barricades to survive the week. Then Tuesday morning arrived. Isabella had spent the previous 48 hours weaponizing her public humiliation. She realized she could not attack my finances directly anymore, so she pivoted to a currency she understood perfectly well: social capital. My phone began to vibrate violently against my wooden nightstand at 6 in the morning. I picked up the device and found 74 unread notifications. I opened my primary social media application. Isabella had launched a highly coordinated campaign across several prominent Kansas City community groups. The narrative she crafted was a masterpiece of selective editing and emotional manipulation. She posted a lengthy, tearful video. She wore an oversized gray sweater, her makeup intentionally smudged to suggest hours of private weeping. She looked directly into the camera lens and told her thousands of followers that her dream wedding had been systematically destroyed by her bitter, ungrateful adopted sister. Isabella claimed I had thrown a massive tantrum during the reception because the attention was not centered on me. She stated I had demanded a full refund on the gifts I had provided, threatening the venue staff and screaming at her new husband until he was forced to cancel the entire event just to protect her safety. The social fallout was instantaneous and brutal. My screen filled with hateful messages from people I had known for 2 decades. Mutual friends blocked my number without asking for my perspective. Distant relatives sent me vicious texts, calling me a parasite and a toxic burden on a generous family. The local elite, the very people I often interacted with for corporate networking, were sharing Isabella and her video hundreds of times. My thumb hovered over the reply button. Every instinct screamed at me to defend myself. I wanted to post the wire transfer receipts, expose David and his secret $1 million land sale, and burn their pristine reputation to the ground. But I am an underwriter. I operate on cold logic, not heated emotion. In my profession, you do not argue with liars on a public forum. You wait for formal discovery. You let them build a towering house of cards, and then you quietly pull the bottom out. I locked my phone screen and tossed the device onto my mattress. The silence in my house was absolute. I poured a glass of cold water and stood by my kitchen window watching the morning commute roll past. Isabella was acting as the vanguard, absorbing all the public attention. But her internet smear campaign was just a red herring. It was a calculated distraction, designed to keep my focus entirely on my ruined reputation. David and Helen were intelligent predators. They knew I would be busy managing the public relations disaster, blocking phone numbers and trying to secure my mental health. They used that exact window of vulnerability to execute a lethal strike against my actual livelihood. The failed bridge loan was just their opening salvo. They had a backup plan, one that did not require a forged signature or a compromised digital network. By Wednesday afternoon, the whispers in the corporate office were impossible to ignore. My colleagues were actively avoiding my cubicle. The usual friendly banter near the coffee machine stopped the moment I walked into the break room. Isabella and her video had clearly penetrated my professional sphere. At 2 o'clock, my desk phone chimed. It was the executive assistant for Richard, the vice president of commercial lending. Richard sat 2 levels above Marcus. He was the man who approved my salary, my annual bonuses, and my continued employment at the firm. The assistant told me to report to his office immediately. I smoothed the front of my charcoal skirt and walked down the long corridor toward the executive suite. My heels sank into the plush carpet, masking the sound of my footsteps. I opened the heavy oak door. Richard was not smiling. He sat behind a massive glass desk, his hands clasped firmly together over a single sheet of printed paper. Marcus was standing in the corner of the room, looking down at his leather shoes. The atmosphere was completely different from Monday morning. There was no benefit of the doubt waiting for me here. The air in the room was cold and sterile. "Sit down, Nama," Richard instructed. His voice was a flat corporate monotone. I took the leather chair opposite his desk. I kept my spine straight and my hands folded in my lap. I willed my breathing to remain steady, though a cold knot was forming rapidly in my stomach. Richard slid the printed paper across the glass surface toward me. It was an email sent directly to his private corporate address, intentionally bypassing the standard human resources filters. The sender was listed only as an anonymous, concerned citizen. I read the text. The black letters blurred together for a fraction of a second before my brain forced them into sharp focus. The email alleged that I was actively using my senior underwriting position to embezzle client funds. The anonymous author claimed I had been skimming percentages off commercial escrow accounts for years to fund a lavish personal lifestyle. The final sentence was the killing blow. It explicitly stated that I had recently used $35,000 of stolen corporate money to pay for a luxury event at the Plaza Pavilion. My lungs tightened. A high-pitched ringing started in my ears. In the financial sector, a rumor about a difficult personality will hold you back from a promotion. A whisper about embezzlement is a permanent death sentence. It triggers immediate termination, federal audits, and the complete revocation of all financial licensing. Isabella had ruined my weekend. Helen had tried to drain my savings. David had tried to force a fraudulent loan. But this anonymous email was designed to put me in a federal penitentiary. "We take anonymous tips with a grain of salt," Richard said, his tone devoid of any actual comfort. However, given the dollar amount explicitly named in this email and the fact that $35,000 is an exact match for the venue dispute currently circulating on local social media channels, corporate compliance requires mandatory action. The machine my family built was closing its steel jaws. They had weaponized my own generosity. They took my money, used it for the wedding, and were now pointing to that exact expenditure as concrete proof of my supposed corporate crimes. They were framing me for the very theft they had committed against me. "I am placing you on unpaid administrative leave effective immediately," Richard announced. He did not look me in the eye. "Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal items. You are locked out of the network pending a full internal investigation." He reached out and took the email back. The new conflict was no longer about saving my pride or protecting my bank accounts. It was about saving my freedom. As I stood up to face the uniformed security guard waiting outside the glass door, I realized my strategy had to change entirely. Playing defense was going to put me behind bars. I had to go on the offensive, and I had exactly a few days to find the hidden ledgers before the auditors destroyed my life. The uniformed security guard did not touch me, but his presence was a heavy, suffocating weight as we walked out of Richard's office. I did not look back at Marcus or the vice president. My posture remained perfectly straight. I marched down the carpeted hallway of the executive suite, past the glass partitions of my colleagues, and arrived at my cubicle. The lending floor had fallen completely silent. 50 pairs of eyes tracked my every movement, analyzing my downfall in real time. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out my personal leather tote. I unclipped my corporate identification badge from my lapel. The plastic felt warm against my skin. I handed it to the guard. I then shut down my secure laptop, folded the screen flat, and pushed the device across my desk. The guard placed a large hand on the machine, officially seizing the bank's property. We walked toward the main exit. The heavy glass doors slid open, and as they closed behind me, the electronic lock engaged with a sharp metallic click. The sound echoed in the lobby like a judge bringing down a heavy wooden gavel. My career was not just paused, it was effectively dead. I walked to the subterranean parking garage and slid into the driver's seat of my sedan. My hands clamped onto the leather steering wheel, my knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white. The engine remained off. I needed to dissect the mechanics of the trap. The anonymous email Richard showed me was not just a vague accusation. It contained highly specific, non-public details about a recent commercial loan I had approved for a local manufacturing firm. The sender knew the exact interest rates, the escrow deposit amounts, and the closing dates. They had acquired classified financial data to make their fake embezzlement tip look terrifyingly credible. I realized how they obtained it. On Saturday night, while I was getting humiliated at the Plaza Pavilion, someone had entered my house to push the fraudulent bridge loan through my personal computer. While they were sitting at my desk, they must have downloaded cached files from my local hard drive, harvesting sensitive corporate information to build their smear campaign. My parents were not merely trying to steal $15,000 anymore. They were actively participating in my professional assassination. They needed to destroy my credibility so completely that if I went to the authorities about the forged banking slip, the police would write me off as a disgruntled, disgraced employee, launching desperate counter-accusations. I started the car and drove out of the financial district. I did not go to a bar to drown my sorrows. I did not call Isabella to scream into the receiver. I am an underwriter. When the numbers look wrong, you hire a forensic expert. I drove directly to a small, unmarked office building in the northern suburbs. The tenant occupying the third floor was a private digital forensics investigator named Elias. I had met him 2 years ago when First Missouri Bank contracted his firm to trace a complex wire fraud ring. Elias was a former cybercrimes detective who drank too much green tea and rarely saw direct sunlight. I walked into his office, placed a retainer check on his desk, and gave him every detail of the anonymous email Richard had received. Find the origin point, I instructed him, my voice devoid of any desperation. Find the internet protocol address, the routing history, whatever digital footprint the sender left behind. They had access to my home network on Saturday. Start there. Elias nodded, cashing the check and opening a terminal on his massive curved monitor. I went home and locked my newly installed deadbolts. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in psychological endurance. I sat in my quiet living room, watching the hands of the wall clock tick forward. The silence of the house was oppressive. My entire identity was tied to my profession. Without my corporate access, without my underwriting portfolio, I felt entirely untethered. Every time a car drove past my window, my muscles tightened, anticipating a police cruiser arriving to arrest me for phantom embezzlement. On Thursday afternoon, my encrypted messaging application chimed. Elias had sent a secure document file. I opened the attachment on my personal tablet. The digital forensics report was 30 pages long, filled with raw data routing tables and server logs. I scrolled down to the executive summary. Elias had successfully bypassed the superficial layers of the anonymous email. The sender had attempted to mask their location, but they were remarkably sloppy. They did not bounce the message through a randomized international virtual private network. Instead, the investigator found hidden tracking pixels embedded deep within the email formatting. Those microscopic pixels communicated directly with a host server to verify when Richard opened the message. Elias traced the host server. The digital footprint led straight back to a registered commercial network node in the Kansas City suburbs. It was the static network address assigned to David's hardware store. I read the paragraph 3 times to ensure my brain was processing the information correctly. The email framing me for a federal crime was not drafted by a mysterious hacker. It was written and dispatched using the inventory management software located in the back office of my father's business. David had used his own retail network to launch the attack, foolishly believing that a fake email address was enough to hide his identity from a bank's security apparatus. The sheer audacity of the maneuver was staggering, but it was also a fatal error. They had handed me the exact weapon I needed to dismantle them. I printed the entire 30-page forensics report. I walked into my home office and laid the papers out on my desk. Next to the report, I placed the photocopy of the forged $15,000 withdrawal slip bearing Helen's handwriting. Beside that, I set the fraudulent $5 million bridge loan application with my copied digital signature. The puzzle pieces were fully assembled. This was no longer a theory. I possessed hard, irrefutable evidence of acute identity theft, wire fraud, and corporate sabotage. I stacked the documents together, tapping the edges against the wooden desk to align the pages perfectly. I slid the thick stack into a fresh manila envelope. The time for waiting was over. I grabbed my car keys, intending to drive straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office downtown. A local police precinct was insufficient for the scale of financial crimes my family was committing. As my fingers wrapped around the brass handle of my front door, a sharp, heavy knock echoed through the wood. I froze. The sound was unexpected. I glanced at the digital screen of my security system. The camera feed showed a man standing on my front porch. It was not David arriving to gloat. It was not a federal agent holding an arrest warrant. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Lucas stood on my welcome mat. The crisp, tailored aesthetic of the forensic accountant was completely gone. He wore a wrinkled gray knit shirt and dark denim jeans. Dark, bruised circles hung heavy beneath his eyes, signaling days of profound sleep deprivation. His posture was slumped, lacking the rigid confidence he had displayed in the venue parking lot on Saturday night. In his left hand, he held a cardboard carrier holding 2 large cups of black coffee. The steam rose in thin wisps through the drinking holes. In his right hand, pinched between his thumb and index finger, he held a small silver flash drive. "I need to come inside, Naima," Lucas said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of all pleasantries. I stepped back, allowing him to enter my foyer. I locked the door behind him. He walked straight to my kitchen island and set the coffee carrier down on the granite counter. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer empty condolences about the ruined weekend or the ensuing social media circus Isabella had manufactured. He placed the small silver flash drive onto the stone surface. The metal casing caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, gleaming like a polished bullet. "What is that?" I asked, keeping my distance. Lucas looked at the tiny storage device. He let out a long, ragged exhale. "After I left the pavilion, I started digging deeper into your family's finances. The $1.2 million land sale was just the surface layer. I spent the last 4 days running localized database searches, pulling old property deeds, and cross-referencing court records from 24 years ago." He looked up, meeting my gaze. The exhaustion in his eyes was eclipsed by a deep, unsettling grimness. "You need to plug this into your computer right now," Lucas commanded quietly, "because David and Helen did not just steal your money this week. They have been stealing from you since the day you moved into their house, and this drive is about to blow the lid off your entire childhood." Section 7. The Alliance and the Flash Drive. "I broke off the engagement permanently," Lucas said, stepping inside. He explained that while clearing his things out of the apartment he shared with Isabella, he found a hidden folder on their shared desktop labeled N Asset Recovery. He handed me the flash drive. "I thought you should see what your family is actually planning." I plugged it into my personal laptop. The drive contained drafted legal complaints and a terrifyingly detailed shadow ledger. The spreadsheet wasn't just tracking the wedding expenses, it went back years, tracking my college tuition, my first car, and my childhood medical bills. Next to it was a column titled Adoption Subsidy. Suddenly, a memory clicked into place. David, on the first of every month during my childhood, complaining bitterly about late state mail. I started doing the arithmetic. The state of Missouri provides a monthly subsidy for adopting a child from the foster system. David and Helen had been receiving state funds from me my entire life, but they had logged it as their own income, billing me for my own state-funded upbringing. The glowing pixels of the forged legal petition burned a permanent image into my retinas. The civil lawsuit draft displayed on my monitor was a masterpiece of domestic extortion. The signature block at the bottom, dated exactly 14 years ago on my 18th birthday, was a flawless replication of my handwriting. David and Helen had not just stolen my government subsidy, they had fabricated a binding promissory note to extract every remaining cent I possessed. The revelation rewired the entire architecture of my childhood. I closed the laptop screen. My hands were shaking not from sorrow, but from a profound, crystalline rage. Every memory required immediate auditing. I recalled sitting in a sterile dental chair at 13 years old. Helen stood in the corner of the examination room, loudly sighing, as the orthodontist quoted the price for my wire braces. She made sure the receptionist heard her lamenting the heavy financial burden of raising a foster child. Yet the state of Missouri had already deposited that exact treatment amount into her checking account 3 weeks prior. My parents had weaponized my existence to cultivate social sympathy, while quietly building a diversified investment portfolio on my back. I needed the foundational documents. The flash drive Lucas provided contained their internal shadow ledger, but a judge requires certified public records to prove systemic fraud. I printed the spreadsheet, shoved the pages into my leather briefcase, and drove straight to the Jackson County Family Court Records Department. The municipal building was a brutalist block of gray concrete located in the center of downtown Kansas City. I bypassed the security checkpoints and took the metal elevator down to the basement archives. The subterranean air smelled heavily of damp paper, old dust, and industrial floor wax. I approached the thick glass partition. A bored clerk wearing a blue cardigan barely glanced up from her computer monitor. I presented my driver's license and demanded to legally unseal my own adoption file. Bureaucracy is a sluggish, stubborn beast. The clerk informed me the historical archives were stored in an off-site facility and required a formal judicial waiver to access. I refused to leave the counter. I spoke in the flat, unyielding tone I normally reserve for defaulting corporate clients. I cited the specific Missouri revised statutes governing adult adoptee access rights, quoting the legal code verbatim. After 3 hours of filling out triplicate request forms, enduring endless hold music, and arguing with a regional supervisor, the clerk finally emerged from a back room holding a thick manila envelope. I carried the heavy package to a scratched wooden table in the corner of the waiting area. The fluorescent lights hummed a low, irritating frequency overhead. I broke the red wax seal. The paper inside was aged, the edges tinged a faint yellow. I bypassed the standard judicial decrees and social worker psychological evaluations. I was hunting for the financial disclosures. I found a stapled packet near the bottom of the stack, labeled clearly as a secondary asset addendum. I smoothed the pages flat against the wood. The document detailed a special trust established by my biological grandmother shortly before she passed away. I never knew the woman. She died when I was an infant, long before the foster system absorbed me. But she had possessed the incredible foresight to leave a designated inheritance. The capital was structured to remain entirely untouched until my 25th birthday. I am 32 years old. My eyes scanned down the page, tracing the legal stipulations. The principal amount of the trust was substantial. It contained enough capital to pay for a premier university education and secure a large down payment on a house. However, the most critical detail was the designated administration clause. When David and Helen legally adopted me, the family court appointed David as the sole financial custodian of that specific asset account. A memory struck me with the kinetic force of a physical blow. The clinical environment of the basement archive vanished completely. I was 18 years old again. It was the evening of my high school graduation. The humid summer air drifted through the open kitchen window of our suburban house. I was sitting at the oak dining table wearing my cheap synthetic graduation gown, feeling a rare sense of accomplishment. David had walked into the room carrying a thick stack of stapled documents. He placed a blue ink pen next to my right hand. He smiled, his teeth bright, exuding the warm paternal pride he perfected for neighborhood barbecues. He told me the papers were complex college grant applications. He insisted the state required my immediate signature to finalize my university financial aid package. He explicitly instructed me not to bother reading the dense legal jargon, assuring me he had already reviewed everything with his personal accountant. He claimed time was rapidly running out to meet the strict federal deadline. I had trusted him without a single hesitation. I picked up the pen and authorized my name on 5 different signature lines. Sitting in the court basement 14 years later, the brutal truth materialized. Those were never educational grants. I had unknowingly endorsed a binding legal waiver voluntarily extending his custodial control over my biological grandmother's trust indefinitely. He had orchestrated the paperwork under the guise of paternal support, effectively locking me out of my own inheritance while I worked grueling double shifts at a local diner just to pay for community college textbooks. The arithmetic was sickening. The $35,000 I had willingly wired to the Plaza Pavilion for Isabella's wedding was not a devastating financial sacrifice. It was merely a microscopic fraction of the wealth they had systematically extracted from my identity. They had drained the state subsidy. They'd hijacked the inheritance fund. They forged my signature on a $5 million commercial bridge loan, and now they were preparing to sue me for the meager savings I had managed to build independently. I carefully returned the historical documents to the manila envelope. I placed the packet inside my briefcase and secured the brass latches. The pieces were no longer scattered across different timelines. I held the entire completed puzzle. I walked out of the municipal building and stepped into the harsh afternoon sunlight. The heat radiating off the asphalt felt entirely distant. My mind was operating at maximum analytical capacity. I unlocked my sedan and started the engine. I navigated through the congested downtown traffic heading toward my quiet neighborhood. The plan moving forward was perfectly clear. I needed to call a ruthless litigation attorney. I required a lawyer who specialized in severe financial abuse and corporate fraud. I intended to freeze David's newly acquired million-dollar real estate assets before the sun went down. I was going to dismantle their pristine suburban reputation brick by brick, exposing every stolen dollar to the public record. I turned onto my street. The manicured lawns and towering oak trees offered a deceptive picture of domestic tranquility. I pressed the button on my sun visor to activate the garage door mechanism. My vehicle rolled slowly up the concrete driveway. I shifted the gear into park and turned off the ignition. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. I reached into my purse for my phone, preparing to begin researching elite legal counsel. Then I looked through my windshield. The plan to make a quiet, strategic phone call evaporated instantly. I was not going to get the chance to draft a calculated legal strategy from the safety of my living room. Sitting directly on my front porch, occupying the woven wicker chairs next to my locked front door, were 2 familiar figures. David wore a pressed white golf shirt, his posture relaxed and confident. Helen sat next to him, holding her expensive designer handbag tightly across her lap. They were not smiling. They did not look like concerned parents dropping by for a casual afternoon visit. They looked like apex predators who had finally cornered their prey, arriving to execute the final phase of their extortion in person. The engine of my sedan ticked rhythmically as the metal cooled in the afternoon heat. I remained seated behind the steering wheel, my hands resting lightly on the leather rim. Through the windshield, the picture of suburban domesticity presented itself like a carefully staged theater set. David occupied the wicker chair on the left side of my front porch, his legs crossed at the ankle. Helen sat adjacent to him, her posture rigid beneath a floral blouse. Between her hands resting squarely on her lap, Helen held a large plastic Tupperware container. Condensation gathered on the inside of the translucent lid, obscuring the contents, but I knew exactly what was inside. It was a batch of her homemade chicken enchiladas. During my teenage years, those enchiladas were the ultimate currency of conditional affection in the Rodriguez household. Helen only baked that specific meal when I achieved something that reflected positively on her parenting. I received them when I brought home a perfect report card, or when I secured a scholarship that relieved their supposed financial burden. She used the heavy aroma of roasted green chilies and melted cheese to signify that I had successfully earned my keep for the month. Seeing that plastic container, now resting on her lap after I had just uncovered decades of systemic financial abuse, was a pathetic, insulting symbol of manipulation. It stood in stark, grotesque contrast to the hundreds of thousands of dollars they had quietly stolen from my identity. I reached across the passenger seat and grabbed the heavy leather handle of my briefcase. The metal latches clinked softly. Inside the compartment rested the printed shadow ledger, the forged withdrawal slip, the fraudulent $5 million loan application, and the faded Jackson County trust documents. I possessed the entire arsenal required to destroy their lives. I opened the car door and stepped onto the concrete driveway. The humid Kansas City air settled over my shoulders. I closed the door with a solid, echoing thud. David and Helen stood up in unison. They arranged their facial features into practiced masks of deep parental concern. They did not look like criminals who had just committed multiple federal offenses. They looked like a devoted older couple arriving to comfort a troubled child. I walked slowly up the concrete path. I did not rush. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to endure the uncomfortable weight of my steady gaze. I stopped at the bottom of the wooden porch steps, keeping a physical barrier between us. "Nama, sweetheart," Helen cooed, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. She stepped forward, extending the Tupperware container slightly. She completely ignored the fact that she had impersonated me at a downtown bank branch mere days ago. She acted as if the forged signature and the attempted $15,000 theft had never occurred. "We brought your favorite dinner. We know you have been under an immense amount of stress lately. This has all gotten entirely out of hand. We want to forgive you for the scene at the wedding." The absolute audacity of her statement hung in the humid air. She was offering me forgiveness for a conflict she had engineered. David stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Helen's shoulder. He played the role of the pragmatic peacemaker perfectly. He reached into the back pocket of his pressed khaki trousers and produced a folded manila envelope. He held it out toward me, his smile tight and practiced. "Your mother is right," David said, his tone, adopting the cadence of a reasonable businessman negotiating a minor contract dispute. "Families fight, emotions run high, but we need to put this ugly business behind us. We just need you to sign this waiver." I did not reach for the envelope. I stared at the brown paper. "What waiver, David?" "It is just a standard release form," he replied smoothly, waving the document an inch closer to my face. "It is for the bank. It will clear up that little joint account misunderstanding from earlier this week. Once you sign this authorizing the transfer, we will make a phone call. We will contact your vice president of commercial lending. We will tell your boss that the anonymous embezzlement email was a terrible mistake, a misunderstanding sent by a confused relative. You can have your corporate career back by tomorrow morning." The architecture of their trap was breathtaking in its simplicity. It was textbook calculated extortion. They were holding my professional reputation hostage. If I signed away my legal rights to investigate the fraudulent bank withdrawal, effectively handing them the $15,000, they would graciously retract the digital assassination that got me suspended. They wanted me to buy back my own livelihood, using the money they were trying to steal. I looked at the cheap plastic Tupperware in Helen's hands. I looked at the manila envelope in David's grip. A lesser person might have screamed. A weaker victim might have swatted the enchiladas onto the wooden planks and demanded justice. But I am an underwriter. I do not deal in emotional outbursts. I deal in verified assets and permanent liabilities. My voice went completely flat and clinical, devoid of any daughterly affection or fear. "I went to the municipal archives this afternoon," I stated, my words cutting cleanly through the heavy summer air. "I legally unsealed the court records. I saw the Jackson County trust documents, David. I saw the secondary asset addendum regarding the financial inheritance from my biological grandmother." The transformation was instantaneous. The practiced, benevolent smile vanished from David's face as if it had been violently wiped away. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. Helen stopped extending the food container. Her eyes widened, darting nervously toward her husband. Their leverage had just evaporated into the atmosphere. The threat of a ruined career meant absolutely nothing when compared to the decades of state subsidies and trust fund capital they had embezzled. They realized simultaneously that the extortion attempt had failed and that I was fully aware of the true magnitude of their crimes. David lowered the manila envelope. The stoic Midwestern hardware store owner disappeared, replaced by the cornered, desperate fraudster beneath the surface. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. He looked at my leather briefcase, suddenly understanding what evidence I might be carrying inside. But David is a predator who has survived for decades by always having a contingency plan. His initial panic lasted only a few seconds before it mutated into a new, incredibly dangerous aggression. He took a heavy step down the wooden stairs, invading my personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the metallic smell of pure adrenaline. "You think you are very smart, Naama," David whispered, his voice vibrating with raw malice. "You think finding an old piece of paper makes you the victor here, but you are forgetting your own profession." I held my ground, gripping the handle of my briefcase tighter. "I did not just send an email to your boss," David continued, his eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. "Last Saturday night, while you were causing a scene at the Plaza Pavilion, I accessed your home network. I initiated a $5 million commercial bridge loan application." "I am aware," I replied coldly. "I saw the forged digital signature." "Did you also see the network routing logs?" David asked, a cruel, triumphant sneer twisting his lips. "I used your exact internet protocol address. I used your proprietary internal authorization stamp. To the federal banking regulators, that document proves that you, the senior underwriter, deliberately attempted to bypass corporate security to fund a fraudulent shell company. My shell company." He took another step closer, forcing me to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. "If you take those trust documents to the police," David threatened, his words striking like precise hammer blows, "I will immediately submit the bridge loan application to the Federal Compliance Oversight Board. I will testify that you orchestrated the entire scheme to steal $5 million from your own employer. I will gladly accept a minor penalty for creating the LLC, but you will be the banking official who executed the wire fraud. They will not just fire you, Naama, they will put you in a federal penitentiary for 20 years. The trap was not broken. It had simply evolved into a mechanism of mutual assured destruction. He had engineered a digital dead man switch. If I moved to reclaim my stolen childhood, he would pull the lever that ended my adult life. I was standing on my own driveway, staring into the eyes of the man who raised me, realizing he was fully prepared to send me to prison just to keep his stolen wealth. The humid Kansas City afternoon pressed down on the concrete driveway, heavy and suffocating. David remained standing inches from my face, the scent of his expensive citrus cologne mingling with the metallic tang of pure malice. He had just threatened to submit the forged $5 million bridge loan to federal regulators, a maneuver designed to send me to a penitentiary. He watched my eyes, waiting for the panic to register. He expected me to crumble, to beg for mercy, to hand over the trust documents and surrender. I did not blink. I gripped the handle of my leather briefcase tighter, my knuckles turning white. I stared back at the man who had pretended to be my father for 2 decades. I analyzed his posture, the slight tremor in his jaw, the rapid pulse beating at the base of his neck. The bridge loan threat was a weapon of mass destruction, but it was also a suicidal tactic. If he exposed the fraudulent application, he would undoubtedly face intense federal scrutiny regarding his own newly formed shell company. He was bluffing, relying on my ingrained childhood fear to force a retreat. I told him to file the application. I told him I would gladly welcome a federal investigation because federal auditors would instantly subpoena his hardware store network logs and uncover the digital footprint he left behind. David's expression hardened. The bluff had failed. The confident, threatening aura of the self-made businessman shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered extortionist beneath. His breathing hitched. He took a half step back, realizing the financial and digital leverage was useless against an underwriter who refused to break under pressure. But a predator always keeps a final, devastating card hidden in his sleeve. "You think you are so smart, Naama," David whispered. The volume of his voice dropped into a dark, gravelly register. "You think you hold all the winning cards because you dug up a faded financial addendum in a municipal basement, but you do not know the whole truth." He stepped closer again, invading my personal space, his eyes burning with a venomous intensity. "The adoption was never fully finalized at the state level," David stated. The words hung in the stagnant air. I frowned, my analytical mind struggling to process the structural impossibility of his claim. I had lived in his house. I carried his surname. I possessed a social security card and a driver's license linking me to their household. When you were 10 years old, David continued, a cruel smile twisting the corners of his mouth, a biological relative emerged from the woodwork, an aunt living in St. Louis. She contested the foster placement. She petitioned the family court claiming she had the primary biological right to raise you. The state of Missouri placed the official adoption decree on a temporary administrative hold while the legal dispute was mediated. I stopped breathing. The historical foundation of my entire existence suddenly felt like it was built on shifting sand. "We fought her, of course," Helen chimed in from the porch steps, her voice losing its artificial sweetness. "We spent thousands of dollars on family attorneys to keep you in our home. We eventually buried her in legal fees until she surrendered the petition and disappeared back to the eastern side of the state." David leaned in, delivering the killing blow. But the family court never officially lifted the administrative hold. The bureaucratic paperwork was never formally completed. Legally, Naama, you exist in a gray area. You are not our verified adopted daughter. You are just a long-term foster placement that aged out of the system. Therefore, I am still the active state-appointed fiduciary of that trust. The earth shifted violently beneath my feet. "If you push this inheritance issue," David threatened, his tone shifting into a cold, clinical cadence, "if you dare bring those archival documents to a judge, I will take the entire estate straight into probate court. I will file a custodial claim demanding the trust principal be liquidated as direct reimbursement for the 24 years of foster care I generously provided. I will tie those assets up in litigation for a decade, and I will drain every single penny to pay my defense attorneys." He stepped away from me, straightening the collar of his pressed golf shirt. The transaction was over. He had delivered the ultimate checkmate. David turned his back and walked toward the passenger side of their pristine luxury SUV parked along the curb. Helen stood up from the wicker chair. She did not look at me. She placed the plastic Tupperware container of homemade chicken enchiladas directly onto the wooden porch steps. It was a final, insulting gesture, a physical reminder of the cheap, conditional love they had used to manipulate me for a lifetime. She walked down the driveway, her designer heels clicking sharply against the concrete. She climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, smooth and powerful. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, disappearing down the tree-lined suburban avenue, leaving me standing completely frozen in the suffocating heat. I looked at the discarded plastic container resting on the wood. The reality of their revelation crashed over me like a freezing tidal wave. If I was not legally their adopted daughter, my entire identity was a clerical error. The danger extended far beyond a stolen inheritance. In the commercial banking sector, maintaining a senior underwriting license requires a flawless, verified legal identity. The federal compliance boards conduct rigorous background checks, cross-referencing birth certificates, adoption decrees, and Social Security records to ensure absolute transparency. If my foundational legal paperwork was fractured, if I was operating under a surname I had no legal right to possess, my federal licensing was inherently invalid. My parents had not just stolen my past, they had just detonated my future. If the banking regulators discovered this discrepancy, I would not just remain suspended, I would be permanently barred from the financial industry, stripped of my credentials, and potentially charged with federal identity misrepresentation. I walked up the steps, stepped over the Tupperware, and unlocked my front door. The interior of my house felt cold and empty. I walked straight to my home office, dropping the heavy leather briefcase onto the floor. I pulled my mobile phone from my pocket. I did not have time to panic. I needed immediate, ruthless legal counsel. I scrolled through my contact list and dialed the private cellular number for Vance Sterling. Vance was a high-powered corporate litigator in downtown Kansas City. I had worked with him extensively during hostile corporate takeovers and aggressive commercial foreclosures. He was brilliant, expensive, and entirely devoid of human empathy. He answered on the second ring. I bypassed all social pleasantries. I laid out the exact parameters of the situation, detailing the unsealed trust documents, the forged legal petition, the fraudulent commercial bridge loan, and the contested adoption revelation. I spoke rapidly, my voice devoid of emotion, presenting the facts as if I were outlining a toxic corporate merger. Vance listened in silence. When I finished, I heard the sound of a keyboard clacking through the receiver as he immediately began searching municipal databases. David is not bluffing about the legal gray area, Naama. Vance said, his voice a low, serious rumble. I am looking at the county probate docket right now. The adoption decree was marked as contested 22 years ago, and the resolution field remains blank. In the eyes of the state, he maintains a default fiduciary hold over your grandmother's estate until a judge formally rules otherwise. I gripped the edge of my wooden desk. Can we file a preemptive strike? Can we block his access to the Capitol? We are already out of time, Vance replied grimly. David's attorneys are aggressive. The docket shows they filed a preliminary notice of intent this morning. They are moving to secure a permanent injunction against the trust. He is petitioning the court to freeze the assets entirely in his name under the guise of outstanding custodial reimbursement. The hearing is scheduled for an emergency docket review on Friday morning. I looked at the digital clock on my computer monitor. It was currently Wednesday afternoon. I have exactly 48 hours. I stated, the reality of the timeline settling heavily into my bones. Less, Vance corrected. If the judge signs that injunction on Friday, the Capitol becomes legally inaccessible. David will slowly bleed the account dry through fabricated administrative fees, and your professional licensing will be red flagged the moment the court recognizes the identity discrepancy. You will lose the money, your career, and your legal name. The machine my family built was executing its final lethal protocol. How do I stop the injunction? I asked, refusing to accept defeat. There is only one legal maneuver that overrides a custodial reimbursement claim in probate court, Vance explained. A biological contest. If the aunt in St. Louis who originally halted the adoption files a motion declaring her biological right to the trust, the judge is forced to immediately suspend David's fiduciary power pending a full federal investigation. It destroys his leverage instantly. The path forward crystallized in my mind. The new conflict was no longer a matter of defensive posturing or analyzing spreadsheets in my quiet home office. It was an active, desperate manhunt. I need to find a woman I have never met, I said, the gravity of the mission altering the rhythm of my heartbeat. A woman who disappeared 22 years ago. You have until Friday morning, Vance warned, the line crackling faintly. Find the Aunt Naama, bring her to the courthouse, or David takes everything. The call disconnected. I lowered the phone. The quiet suburban house felt like a trap waiting to spring closed. I grabbed my car keys from the desk. I had 48 hours to drive across the state of Missouri, locate a biological ghost, and convince a stranger to save my life before the clock permanently ran out. I aimed the hood of my sedan east, merging onto Interstate 70. The 4-hour transit across the state of Missouri provided a brutal expanse of highway to dissect my collapsing reality. The dashboard clock glowed against the gathering twilight, a digital countdown marching toward Friday morning. My hands gripped the steering wheel while my mind calculated the devastating probabilities of failure. If I failed to locate the woman listed in the municipal archives, my federal underwriting license would dissolve, my legal identity would vanish, and David would seize the entirety of my biological inheritance. The address printed in the unsealed file belonged to a working-class neighborhood located deep within the southern perimeter of St. Louis. I navigated through narrow residential streets lined with aging brick bungalows and overgrown oak trees. The environment offered a stark, grounded contrast to the sterile, manicured subdivisions my adoptive parents occupied. I parked alongside a crumbling curb. The humid night air wrapped around my shoulders as I stepped onto the pavement. I approached a modest house with a faded green awning. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my collarbone. I raised my fist and knocked firmly against the weathered wooden door. A minute passed. A deadbolt clicked. The heavy door swung inward. An older woman stood in the threshold. The porch light illuminated her features, sending a violent shockwave through my nervous system. I had spent my entire existence navigating the world without a single genetic reflection. I never shared Helen's bone structure or David's coloring. Now, staring at the resident of this quiet home, I saw a terrifyingly accurate projection of my own future. She possessed the exact same almond-shaped hazel eyes, the identical sharp jawline, and the precise olive complexion I saw in my mirror every morning. This was Rosa, my biological aunt. I opened my mouth, preparing to deliver a carefully rehearsed, legally precise introduction. I intended to state my name, verify her identity, and outline the impending probate court injunction. I never managed to speak a single syllable. Rosa inhaled sharply, her hands flying upward to cover her mouth. The sheer force of her sudden realization fractured her composure completely. Tears instantly flooded her hazel eyes, spilling over her weathered cheeks in heavy streams. She recognized me before I could utter a word. I braced my core, expecting a defensive reaction. I anticipated hostility, or at least a firm demand to leave the property. People who abandon their relatives rarely welcome the sudden arrival of their past sins. Instead, she reached forward, gripping my forearms with a desperate, trembling strength. She pulled me across the threshold, leading me into a dimly lit living room that smelled faintly of dried lavender and old books. Rosa ushered me toward a worn velvet sofa. She collapsed into an adjacent armchair, wiping her face with the sleeve of her cardigan. The emotional display felt entirely foreign to my analytical processing. I demanded answers, my voice sharp and unwavering, slicing through the heavy sentimentality. I asked why she contested the placement 2 decades ago, only to abruptly vanish and leave me stranded in a household built on systemic financial abuse. Her response delivered a narrative rupture that fundamentally altered my understanding of history. Rosa had not filed the family court petition out of petty malice or spontaneous regret. She initiated the custody battle because she possessed the clarity to see exactly what David and Helen were orchestrating. She leaned forward, her voice a fragile, raspy whisper. She explained that during the initial foster transition, she observed how aggressively David inquired about the municipal subsidies. She watched Helen inventory my meager belongings like a tax auditor. Rosa recognized that the prosperous suburban couple did not view a traumatized orphan as a child needing sanctuary. They viewed me as a highly lucrative, unregulated revenue stream. I challenged her narrative, asking why she abandoned the lawsuit if her intentions were so righteous. I pointed out the blank resolution field in the county docket, the bureaucratic gray area that currently threatened my professional existence. Rosa lowered her gaze, her shoulders sagging under the immense weight of decades-old shame. She confessed that she did not surrender the legal fight voluntarily. She lacked the immense capital required to sustain a protracted war against David's high-priced corporate litigators. She was a single woman working multiple minimum wage shifts, barely managing her own electrical bills. Then she revealed the exact mechanism of her defeat. David visited this very house 22 years ago. He arrived holding a cashier check. He offered her $10,000 in exchange for abandoning the custody claim permanently. My breath caught in my throat. I instantly recognized the financial origin of that bribe. I knew the initial principal deposited by my biological grandmother. I understood compound interest yields. David had not used his own hardware store profits to pay off my only living relative. He had utilized the early dividends generated by my own trust fund to finance the extortion. He essentially used my inheritance to purchase my isolation. Rosa stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked across the living room toward a heavy steel filing cabinet tucked into a dark corner. She retrieved a small brass key from a ceramic bowl on a nearby shelf and inserted it into the lock. The metal drawer slid open with a metallic scrape. She reached inside and withdrew a pristine, heavy parchment envelope. The red wax seal on the back remained unbroken, bearing the official stamp of a state notary public. Rosa walked back to the sofa and placed the thick package directly into my lap. She looked into my eyes, her expression shifting from profound sorrow to an absolute, unyielding intensity. She told me the archival ledger I uncovered in the municipal basement only told a fraction of the story. My grandmother did not merely leave a cash reserve designated for educational expenses. She was a brilliant, pragmatic woman who understood the chaotic nature of sudden death. Alongside the standard capital, she had purchased a massive, comprehensive life insurance policy. David could not access the primary insurance payout. The legislation governing those specific financial instruments was incredibly rigid. He required 2 extremely specific pieces of physical documentation to liquidate the massive principal. He needed the original certified death certificate, and he needed the specialized beneficiary addendum naming him as the authorized executor. He possessed neither. Rosa had secured both documents the week her mother passed away, locking them inside this steel cabinet where David's expensive lawyers could never reach them. I stared at the heavy envelope resting on my thighs. The mathematical implications exploded across my consciousness. I asked Rosa for the exact value of the inaccessible policy. She told me the principal amounted to over $400,000. The money had been sitting completely stagnant inside a secured corporate escrow account for over 2 decades, accumulating massive amounts of unverified interest. The architecture of David's final trap snapped into crystal clear focus. The encounter on my front porch earlier that afternoon was never about a minor $15,000 misunderstanding. The manila folder he tried to force me to sign was not a simple banking release form. It was a comprehensive waiver designed to legally bypass the missing documentation. If I had signed that paper to save my corporate underwriting job, I would have handed him the final key necessary to unlock nearly $500,000. I gripped the edges of the notarized envelope. The paper felt heavy, loaded with enough financial ammunition to completely obliterate my adoptive parents' suburban empire. I possessed the missing links. I held the absolute power to legally claim the escrow, verify my identity, and destroy the probate injunction before Friday morning. However, a terrifying new variable immediately materialized. I broke the wax seal and extracted the official documents. I scanned the dense legal topography, searching for the name of the institution managing the massive escrow reserve. My eyes landed on the bold corporate logo printed at the top of the beneficiary addendum. My blood ran freezing cold. The financial institution holding the $400,000 was not a random regional credit union. It was the First National Commerce Bank of Missouri. That was the exact same federal banking corporation where I was currently employed as a senior commercial loan underwriter. It was the precise institution where my digital credentials were currently suspended under active investigation for a $5 million wire fraud conspiracy. Transferring the escrow into my name required presenting these physical original documents to a senior branch manager in person. There was no digital workaround. To claim my grandmother's inheritance and defeat David in probate court, I had to walk directly into the main lobby of the corporate entity that was actively preparing to hand me over to federal authorities. Stepping through those glass doors meant risking immediate detention by internal compliance officers before I ever reached the teller counter. The 4-hour return drive across the dark Missouri highway passed in a blur of intense focus. The red numbers on my dashboard ticked toward midnight as I kept my eyes fixed on the pavement stretching back toward Kansas City. Beside me on the passenger seat, the heavy leather briefcase no longer felt like a collection of desperate defenses. Locked securely inside were the original notarized death certificate, the unedited beneficiary addendum, and a signed sworn affidavit from my biological Aunt Rosa. I was no longer playing defense against a family of calculated predators. I possessed the exact legal mechanism required to dismantle their financial empire brick by brick. At precisely 8 o'clock the following morning, I stood inside the high-rise office of Vance Sterling in downtown Kansas City. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, illuminating the polished mahogany desk where Vance sat reviewing the documents. The ruthless corporate litigator did not smile often, but as he flipped through Rosa's notarized statement and cross-referenced it with the unsealed probate records, a cold, sharp glint appeared in his eyes. "This changes the entire legal landscape," Vance stated, setting down his pen. The existence of the original policy addendum proves active bad faith concealment by David. He did not merely manage a trust, he systematically hid primary asset documentation from the court while attempting to convert the funds for personal gain. We did not wait for Friday morning emergency hearing. Vance drafted an immediate ex parte petition, a rare legal motion, submitted directly to the presiding probate judge without prior notice to the opposing party. We alleged imminent flight risk, systemic fraud, and deliberate asset dissipation. I sat in the court gallery for 2 anxious hours while the judge reviewed the evidence in chambers. The forged withdrawal slips, the shadow ledger, the hidden state subsidies, and the newly uncovered St. Louis policy documents formed an undeniable chain of criminal misconduct. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the judge signed the emergency order. The court issued a sweeping temporary restraining order that instantly froze every private checking account, savings vehicle, investment portfolio, and commercial operating line held in the names of David Rodriguez, Helen Rodriguez, and their associated corporate entities. Their liquid capital was completely locked. They could not move a single dollar. Now I needed to formally serve the court papers. Standard legal procedure allows a process server to deliver the documents, but I requested the certified process binder directly from the court clerk. I wanted to deliver the blow myself. I wanted to witness the exact moment their carefully constructed illusion of wealth and moral superiority shattered into dust. I knew exactly where to find them. Isabella had spent her entire upbringing absorbing our mother's obsession with public status. To Isabella, appearance was the only currency that truly mattered. After Lucas broke off their engagement and moved his belongings out of their downtown apartment, my sister did not mourn the death of her relationship. She immediately launched a desperate campaign to preserve her standing in Kansas City high society. Within 48 hours, she managed to secure a public date with the eldest son of a prominent local real estate developer. To celebrate this swift recovery, Isabella had organized an extravagant dinner party at the Oakwood Country Club. It was the premier private establishment in the city, a place where multimillionaires gathered to negotiate deals over expensive wine and prime cuts of beef. David and Helen had spent 20 years paying exorbitant membership dues just to sit at those white cloth tables and pretend they belonged to the upper crest of society. I returned home briefly to change my clothes. I selected a crisp, charcoal gray tailored suit paired with a silk blouse and dark leather heels. It was my professional armor, the exact attire I wore when rejecting multi-million-dollar commercial loan applications for underqualified developers. I adjusted my jacket in the mirror, grabbed the thick blue process binder from my desk, and drove straight to the country club. The valet attendant at the entrance of the estate stared in surprise as my modest sedan pulled up behind a line of imported luxury sports cars. I stepped out of the vehicle, holding the heavy blue binder tightly under my arm. I walked past the marble fountains, bypassed the front reception desk, and marched directly down the grand hallway leading toward the main dining room. The formal restaurant was bathed in soft chandelier light. The gentle clink of crystal glasses and polite ambient chatter filled the cavernous room. Waiters in tuxedo vests moved silently between tables adorned with silver cutlery and fresh white linens. I spotted their table immediately. They occupied the prime dining station in the center of the room, seated beneath a massive crystal chandelier. Isabella sat near the head of the table, wearing a flashy designer dress, laughing loudly at something her new boyfriend said. His wealthy parents sat opposite them, looking mildly amused. David and Helen sat at the far end of the table, beaming with artificial pride, fully enjoying the illusion of high society acceptance. My heavy leather heels clicked rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor as I approached their table. The sharp sound broke the quiet atmosphere, causing nearby patrons to turn their heads. Isabella was the first to notice my approach. Her laughter ceased instantly. Her posture went rigid, and a look of deep disgust crossed her face. She pushed her chair back slightly, setting her wineglass down with a sharp thud that drew the attention of her boyfriend's parents. "What are you doing here?" Isabella sneered, her voice echoing across the quiet dining room. "You are embarrassing us. Security is going to throw you out again, just like they did at the wedding venue." I completely ignored her. I did not look at her dress, nor did I acknowledge the wealthy estate developer sitting beside her. The dramatic irony hanging over the table was thick and suffocating. They sat there assuming I was still the desperate, cornered foster child struggling to survive their extortion. They had no idea I held the original St. Louis documents in my possession. They had no idea the legal ground beneath their feet had already caved in. I stepped up to the edge of the table, stopping directly beside David. He looked up from his plate, his expression shifting from mild irritation to a cold, warning glare. He leaned in slightly, preparing to whisper another threat about the $5 million wire fraud framing attempt. Before he could utter a single word, I lifted the thick blue process binder high above the table. I brought it down with deliberate force, slamming the heavy legal dossier directly onto the center of his plate. The impact shattered his porcelain dish, splattering rich brown sauce and roasted asparagus across the pristine white tablecloth. The sharp crack echoed through the cavernous dining room like a gunshot. The entire restaurant went dead silent. Diners at surrounding tables froze mid-conversation. Isabella gasped in horror, covering her mouth as sauce speckled her designer dress. "You have been served, David." I stated, my voice completely steady, carrying across the silent room with absolute clarity. David stared at the shattered plate, his face turning a deep, angry crimson. "What is the meaning of this outrage?" he barked, attempting to rise from his chair to assert dominance. I stood my ground, leaning over the table so my eyes were level with his. "That is an emergency ex parte injunction issued by the Jackson County Probate Court," I explained in a cold, clinical cadence. "It includes a copy of the original St. Louis policy addendum and my Aunt Rosa's sworn affidavit. As of 2 hours ago, the state of Missouri has placed an absolute freeze on every single private and commercial bank account registered in your name. You no longer have access to a single dollar." David's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained from his face as the reality of his financial paralysis set in. Helen let out a sharp, choked gasp, dropping her fork onto the table. I turned my attention to the waiter who was cautiously approaching the table to assess the disruption. "You might want to collect payment for their meal immediately," I told the waiter calmly. "Their credit cards will not clear." I looked back down at David, who sat completely paralyzed in his chair. "Enjoy the dinner," I said smoothly. I turned on my heel and began walking toward the exit, my head held high. Behind me, the country club erupted into a chaotic murmur of shocked whispers and hushed arguments. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cool evening air, feeling an unprecedented sense of victory. Then, as I reached my sedan in the parking lot, my mobile phone began buzzing violently in my jacket pocket. I pulled out the device and looked at the glowing screen. It was not a call from Vance Sterling. It was an urgent, automated alert from the internal security network at First National Commerce Bank. A high-priority federal compliance warrant had just been executed against my personal and professional accounts, flagging me for immediate arrest regarding the $5 million wire fraud. David's digital trap had just sprung while I was at the country club, and federal agents were already en route to my home address. The vibrating phone in the country club parking lot threatened to unravel everything. A federal compliance warrant is not a minor administrative hurdle. It is a mechanism designed to strip a financial professional of their freedom. Sitting inside my sedan on that Friday evening, watching the red notification flash across my screen, I did not surrender to panic. I called Vance Sterling. The ruthless corporate litigator did not even hesitate. He instructed me to drive directly to his downtown office, bypassing my home entirely to avoid the federal agents executing the search protocol. We spent 48 hours constructing an impenetrable digital fortress. Vance contacted the regional director of the Federal Compliance Board early Saturday morning. He presented the St. Louis trust documents, Rosa's sworn affidavit, and the detailed shadow ledger I recovered from the hidden flash drive. More importantly, we subpoenaed my neighborhood's telecommunications data. We proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the $5 million wire fraud application originated from a local hardware store's administrative network, not my personal router. By Sunday evening, the federal crosshairs had completely shifted. My underwriting license was restored, and David inadvertently triggered an active cybercrime investigation against his own commercial enterprise. By Monday morning, the retaliatory machine I activated was operating at maximum capacity. The Jackson County probate judge upheld the emergency ex parte injunction without modification. The results were instantaneous and catastrophic for my adoptive parents. Every single financial artery they possessed was severed. David's commercial operating lines were frozen, halting all inventory purchases for his business. The lucrative real estate funds he planned to use for his suburban expansion were locked tightly in a municipal escrow account. The psychological collapse occurred exactly as I anticipated. Helen initiated the descent. She called my mobile device 14 times before the clock struck noon. I routed her number directly to a secure voicemail server and listened to the recordings from the safety of Vance's leather conference chair. The audio files presented a fascinating psychological study of a cornered narcissist. Her initial messages were laced with furious, venomous threats, promising to destroy my reputation and demanding I withdraw the court order immediately. By the seventh call, her tone fractured. The aggressive posturing dissolved into desperate sobbing apologies. She wept openly, pleading for a private mediation, claiming she never understood the true severity of her husband's actions. She was attempting to rewrite history, portraying herself as a naive bystander rather than the enthusiastic architect of my financial exploitation. I deleted the voicemails. Sympathy requires a foundation of truth, and Helen had spent 24 years building an empire on fabricated affection. However, the Rodriguez family rarely conceded defeat without exhausting every malicious avenue available. Isabella represented the next wave of their offensive strategy. My sister operated under the delusion that she could manipulate high-stakes legal warfare using the petty, vindictive tactics she perfected during our adolescence. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy oak doors of our conference room swung open. Isabella marched inside, completely bypassing the reception desk security. She wore a dark designer trench coat, her face pulled into a tight, severe expression. She did not bother greeting me. She locked her gaze directly on Vance, projecting an aura of manufactured confidence. Isabella slammed her expensive leather handbag onto the polished mahogany table. She announced that she possessed information capable of destroying the primary witness in our case. She claimed she was prepared to contact the local press and file a formal police report accusing Lucas of severe domestic abuse during their engagement. She threatened to release fabricated photographs of bruising and submit a sworn statement detailing a history of violent coercion unless I dropped the probate lawsuit immediately. Her strategy was vile but calculated. She hoped to leverage my loyalty to Lucas, forcing me to surrender my inheritance to protect an innocent man from public destruction. I sat perfectly still, observing her performance. I did not speak. I simply turned my head and looked at my attorney. Vance Sterling did not display a single ounce of surprise or outrage. He was a veteran of hostile corporate litigation. Blackmail attempts were merely a Tuesday afternoon diversion. He calmly reached across the table and picked up his sleek silver tablet. He tapped the glass screen twice, pulled up a specific digital file, and slid the device smoothly across the polished wood until it rested inches from Isabella's fingertips. Isabella glanced down, a flicker of uncertainty breaking her confident facade. "You are referencing an alleged physical altercation that occurred on the evening of October 12th, Vance stated, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. "Unfortunately for your narrative, Miss Rodriguez, Lucas anticipated your retaliatory nature the moment he uncovered the hidden asset recovery folder on your shared desktop." The tablet screen displayed a highly detailed, legally binding affidavit signed by Lucas. Attached to the document was a continuous, time-stamped video file captured by a hotel security camera. Vance leaned forward, folding his hands together. That footage places Lucas in the main lobby of a Marriott hotel located in downtown Chicago at the exact hour you claim the assault occurred. He was attending a mandatory forensic accounting conference. We possess his flight manifests, his corporate credit card receipts, and sworn statements from 3 separate firm partners who dined with him that entire weekend. Isabella stared at the glowing screen. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. The malicious confidence evaporated from her posture, replaced by the crushing realization that she had walked blindly into an ambush. "If you utter a single public accusation against my client's former fiancé, Vance," continued his tone dropping an octave, "I will not simply sue you for defamation. I will refer this interaction to the district attorney as an explicit attempt to extort a primary witness in an active federal fraud investigation. You will face felony intimidation charges before sunset." My sister did not utter another word. She grabbed her handbag, turned on her heel, and fled the conference room, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her. The blackmail attempt was neutralized with surgical precision. With Isabella's offensive strike dismantled and Helen reduced to leaving frantic voice recordings, David realized his family was entirely out of ammunition. He recognized that intimidation and emotional manipulation were no longer viable tactics. He was forced to enter the arena of legitimate legal negotiation, an environment where his counterfeit superiority held zero value. An hour later, the receptionist buzzed the intercom, announcing the arrival of opposing counsel. David did not appear in person. He sent his senior defense attorney, a weary-looking man carrying a slim leather briefcase. The lawyer took a seat across from us, wiping a thin layer of perspiration from his forehead. He did not engage in preliminary pleasantries. He opened his briefcase and produced a single, sharply drafted contract. He pushed the document toward me. It was a formal settlement proposition. My client is prepared to surrender his fiduciary claim to the St. Louis Trust entirely, the opposing counsel stated. Maintaining a rigid professional detachment, he will authorize the immediate release of the $400,000 principal directly into your personal accounts. He will cease all probate litigation regarding your adoption status. I looked at the crisp white paper. It was the exact victory I had driven across the state to secure. It was the absolute return of my stolen inheritance. However, the defense attorney tapped his pen against the bottom half of the contract. This surrender is contingent upon two non-negotiable clauses. The lawyer added, his voice tightening, "First, you must sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. You are legally barred from ever discussing the shadow ledger, the state subsidies, or the forged bridge loan with any third party. Second, you must formally withdraw your criminal fraud referral from the Federal Compliance Board." I stared at the clauses. It was a classic golden parachute. David was offering to give me back my own money in exchange for buying his freedom from federal prison. "If you refuse this settlement," the opposing counsel warned, leaning slightly forward, "my client has authorized me to drag this probate dispute out for years. We will file endless procedural motions. We will appeal every minor ruling. We will keep the escrow locked in litigation until your legal fees completely bankrupt you. You might eventually win the war, Naama, but you will starve to death on the battlefield." The threat of financial attrition hung heavily in the quiet room. It was a brutal, realistic warning. But as I read the specific language embedded within the non-disclosure agreement, a crucial detail caught my attention. The contract did not just demand silence regarding my own financial abuse. The legal phrasing extended the requested immunity to cover all internal accounting records, spanning the entire two-decade history of his hardware business. I raised my eyes, locking my gaze on the weary defense attorney. A surprising, electrifying realization coursed through my veins. David was not terrified of the Federal Compliance Board discovering the forged $5 million bridge loan. He was terrified of federal agents seizing his corporate hard drives. He was using the trust fund as a distraction to hide a much larger, infinitely more destructive crime buried deep inside his own company. The formal settlement proposition rested in the exact center of the polished mahogany table. The crisp white paper seemed to radiate a heavy gravitational pull, anchoring the attention of everyone inside the conference room. I stared at the printed text, my eyes tracing the sharp black ink that spelled out my proposed salvation. The terms were brutally straightforward. I could retrieve my grandmother's $400,000 legacy, reclaim my pristine professional standing in the commercial banking sector, and permanently sever my ties with the radioactive toxicity of the Rodriguez household. All I had to do was provide my signature, accept the mandatory silence dictated by the non-disclosure agreement, and walk away. It was the easy route. It was the designated emergency exit designed to appeal to human exhaustion. Vance Sterling sat beside me, his posture completely still. He did not offer any verbal counsel or pressure me toward a specific decision. He simply observed my face, a silent question, communicating itself through his steady gaze. As an elite litigator, Vance understood that this was no longer a matter of legal strategy. This was a fundamental test of character. Across the wide expanse of the table, David's senior defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. A thin bead of perspiration traveled down his temple. He watched my hands, waiting for my fingers to reach for the silver pen resting nearby. The defense counsel, and by extension the man who hired him, was banking entirely on my lifelong psychological conditioning. For 24 years, I occupied a highly specific, carefully engineered role within our suburban family dynamic. I was the utility daughter. I was the pragmatic shock absorber deployed to manage crises, balance the household checkbook, and quietly repair whatever Isabella managed to destroy. When a pipe burst in the basement, I handled the plumber. When the property taxes spiked, I contributed my dinner wages to cover the difference. I was programmed to keep the peace at all costs, absorbing the emotional and financial deficit so my adoptive parents could maintain their pristine social facade. David firmly believed that conditioning was permanent. He assumed that beneath my tailored charcoal suit and my corporate underwriter title, I was still the frightened, compliant foster child who would inherently flinch at the terrifying prospect of a protracted, bankrupting courtroom war. He calculated that my desire for stability would inevitably override my demand for justice. He severely miscalculated. I did not view the settlement document as a lifeline. I viewed it as a confession. I reached forward. My fingers bypassed the silver pen completely. I grasped the top and bottom edges of the thick parchment contract. The conference room was completely silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the overhead air conditioning vents. I pulled my hands in opposite directions. The thick parchment resisted for a fraction of a second before yielding. The sharp, violent sound of tearing paper echoed loudly against the mahogany walls. I ripped the settlement offer meticulously down the center, dividing the signature line into two useless pieces. I aligned the torn halves, grasped the edges again, and executed a second deliberate tear. I placed the 4 mutilated quadrants of the contract back onto the polished wood, sliding them gently toward the opposing counsel. No non-disclosure agreement, I stated. My voice was entirely devoid of anger or hesitation. The cadence emerged as flat, clinical, and precise as a commercial risk assessment report. There will be no financial settlement. There will be no private mediation. Send the criminal fraud referral directly to the district attorney. The defense lawyer stared at the torn pieces of paper. The remaining color vanished from his face, leaving his complexion a sickly translucent shade of gray. His mouth opened slightly, but his vocal cords failed to produce a coherent sound. He had walked into this meeting armed with the ultimate threat of financial attrition, expecting an immediate capitulation. He had completely failed to recognize the tactical error embedded within his own extortion attempt. They had severely underestimated the consequences of cornering a forensic specialist. By attempting to drain my resources and destroy my career, they inadvertently forced me to apply my professional expertise to their personal history. They compelled me to audit their entire lives. You fundamentally misunderstand the current battlefield, I explained, leaning forward slightly, interlacing my fingers on the edge of the table. You assumed I would blindly accept the confidentiality clause because I was desperate for the escrow capital, but your client was entirely too greedy with his legal phrasing. The immunity stipulations drafted in that document did not merely request silence regarding my stolen adoption subsidies. The text explicitly demanded comprehensive non-disclosure regarding all internal corporate accounting practices associated with David's hardware franchise spanning the last 2 decades. The attorney swallowed hard. His hands began to tremble imperceptibly. I am a senior commercial loan underwriter, I continued, holding his panicked gaze. My entire existence revolves around identifying hidden corporate liabilities. When David drafted that incredibly broad confidentiality clause, he did not protect his business. He highlighted a massive vulnerability. He essentially handed me a map and told me exactly where he buried the bodies. I turned my attention briefly to Vance, who was now leaning back in his chair, a faint, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. Last night, I reviewed the shadow ledger Lucas extracted from my sister's hidden computer directory, I told the sweating lawyer. I did not just look at the column detailing my stolen state stipends. I analyzed the adjacent data fields. I reverse-engineered the mathematical formulas David utilized to track his corporate revenue. He was not merely running a profitable neighborhood hardware store. He was executing a highly sophisticated cash-skimming operation. The silence in the room grew heavy and suffocating. The ledger proves that David systematically inflated his wholesale inventory purchasing costs while simultaneously underreporting his daily retail cash flow I outlined meticulously. He funneled the undocumented surplus capital into the same offshore shell companies he recently used to apply for the fraudulent $5 million bridge loan. He has been actively defrauding the government for a minimum of 15 years. You have absolutely no certified proof of those allegations, the defense counsel stammered, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. A stolen digital spreadsheet is circumstantial at best. It will never hold up during a formal evidentiary hearing. It does not have to hold up in a civil probate court, I countered smoothly, because this conflict is no longer a localized civil dispute over a grandmother's trust fund. I reached inside my leather briefcase and retrieved a thin manila folder. I extracted 3 printed confirmation receipts and arrayed them across the table adjacent to the torn settlement contract. At 7 o'clock this morning, I formally submitted the entire encrypted shadow ledger to the investigative division of the Missouri Department of Revenue. I revealed. I included the verified network routing logs proving David manipulated my internet protocol address. I attached the forged signature applications. I provided a comprehensive step-by-step forensic breakdown of his entire money laundering methodology. The lawyer stared at the government confirmation receipts. The realization of absolute defeat washed over his features. The retaliatory strike was irreversible. The state tax authorities do not care about family drama or contested adoptions, I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. They care about decades of massive, premeditated tax evasion. The department has officially flagged his commercial enterprise for a catastrophic Tier 1 audit. The Federal Internal Revenue Service will undoubtedly join the investigation before the end of the week. This is officially a federal tax issue. Your client is not going to spend the next decade fighting me in probate court. He is going to spend the rest of his natural life fighting the United States government from a concrete cell. The attorney slowly closed his leather briefcase. He recognized that there was no remaining legal maneuver capable of stopping the avalanche I had just triggered. He stood up on shaky legs, offering no parting remarks, and hastily exited the conference room. I let out a slow, controlled breath. The adrenaline began to recede, replaced by a profound, echoing sense of victory. I had dismantled the machine. I had protected my future and ensured the permanent destruction of the predators who raised me. Vance Sterling closed his silver tablet. "That was an exceptionally ruthless maneuver, Naama," he noted, his tone conveying deep professional respect. "The Department of Revenue will dismantle his entire life. The hardware store will be seized, the suburban estate will be liquidated to cover the back taxes, and the criminal penalties will be insurmountable. The board is clear. You won." I nodded, feeling the tension finally releasing from my shoulders. I began gathering my documents, preparing to walk out of the building and resume my reclaimed life. However, the intercom on Vance's desk emitted a sharp, urgent buzz. Vance pressed the blinking button. "Yes?" Mr. Sterling, the receptionist's voice, echoed through the speaker, laced with uncharacteristic panic. "There are 3 armed individuals in the reception area. They are wearing tactical vests bearing the insignia of the Federal Criminal Investigation Division. They are presenting a sealed federal indictment warrant." Vance frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "An indictment for David Rodriguez? They are moving incredibly fast." "No, sir," the receptionist replied, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "The warrant is not for David Rodriguez. They are demanding immediate custody of Naama Rodriguez." The blood instantly vanished from my extremities. The temperature in the room plummeted. Vance surged to his feet, grabbing the printed tax confirmation receipts from the table. "That is impossible. We cleared her name with the compliance board yesterday. The wire fraud allegations were completely neutralized." "They are not here for the wire fraud, sir," the receptionist clarified, the sound of heavy boots echoing faintly through the intercom feed. "The lead agent states they are executing an arrest warrant for masterminding a 15-year corporate tax evasion conspiracy." The earth violently collapsed beneath my feet. A horrifying, paralyzing realization struck my mind with the force of a freight train. David knew I would eventually audit his company. He knew the Missouri Department of Revenue would eventually uncover the massive offshore skimming operation. He had not just forged my signature on a single bridge loan. When I was 18 years old, signing those fake college grant applications at the kitchen table, I had not merely waived my right to the inheritance. The missing puzzle piece suddenly locked into place. David had legally installed my name as the primary executive officer of his fraudulent holding company. For 14 years, I had been the unwitting corporate architect of his entire criminal empire. By submitting the shadow ledger to the government, I had not triggered an investigation into my adoptive father. I had just handed the federal authorities a flawless, comprehensive confession to a crime carrying a 30-year prison sentence, effectively locking myself inside the very cage I built for him. The lead federal agent stepped into the conference room. He wore a dark, tactical vest over a pressed white shirt. He carried a heavy manila folder containing the sealed federal indictment. He stated my full name and instructed me to place my hands flat on the mahogany table. The room began to spin. The walls of the office felt like they were collapsing inward. I had spent my entire adult life meticulously following every complex financial regulation, only to be cornered by a phantom holding company bearing my own stolen identity. I stood frozen, waiting for the heavy steel handcuffs to snap around my wrists. Vance Sterling did not flinch. He did not raise his hands in surrender. He stepped directly between my trembling form and the armed federal agents. He spoke with the absolute, unwavering authority of a man who commanded high-stakes courtrooms for a living. He informed the lead investigator that executing that specific warrant would be the most catastrophic career mistake the agent could possibly make. Vance pointed a steady finger toward the torn settlement contract and the official government confirmation receipts scattered across the wood surface. He explained clearly that the woman standing in this room was not the architect of the massive tax evasion syndicate. He declared that I was the primary whistleblower who had just hand-delivered the entire criminal network to the Department of Revenue 10 minutes prior. The lead agent frowned. His hand hovered nervously near his utility belt. Vance picked up his silver tablet and displayed the forensic network routing logs Lucas had expertly recovered. He cross-referenced the digital footprint of the holding company with the forged 18-year-old signature on the fake college grant applications. Vance walked the federal investigator through the historical timeline. He proved that David possessed exclusive administrative control over the offshore accounts. He demonstrated perfectly that my name was merely a fabricated shield. It was a fraudulent corporate proxy established while I was still legally a teenage foster child. The agent reviewed the digital timestamps, compared them to my high school academic transcripts, and recognized the absolute physical impossibility of my involvement. The heavy tension in the room finally broke. The agent lowered his aggressive posture. He realized the prosecution had inadvertently targeted the primary victim of a massive long-term identity theft operation. The federal warrant was not executed. Instead, the legal document was immediately amended on the spot. The investigative crosshairs shifted entirely away from my professional credentials. They locked directly onto the suburban hardware empire David had spent decades building on a foundation of stolen money. The poetic justice that followed was absolute and breathtaking in its swift execution. David and Helen were formally indicted on multiple federal charges. The grand jury recommended maximum sentences for aggravated identity theft, corporate wire fraud, and systemic tax evasion. The Federal Bureau of Investigation coordinated a simultaneous dawn raid on their pristine residential estate and their commercial properties. The local television news stations broadcast the dramatic footage of David being escorted out of his hardware franchise wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. The stoic, self-made businessman facade completely shattered under the blinding glare of camera flashes. The Internal Revenue Service operates without mercy. They audited the shadow ledger and discovered the massive, undocumented surplus capital David had skimmed for a decade and a half. Furthermore, the federal tax authorities penalized my adoptive parents for the very mechanism they used to exploit my childhood. Because David and Helen had illegally converted the state adoption subsidies into personal income without ever reporting the revenue the government levied, catastrophic financial penalties against their estate. The tax agency seized the hardware store real estate entirely. They liquidated their diverse investment portfolios and foreclosed on their luxury suburban home to cover the compounded back taxes and fraud fines. They were left with absolutely nothing. Their entire affluent existence was reduced to a negative balance on a federal balance sheet. Isabella experienced her own unique brand of social devastation. My sister had constructed her entire identity around the fragile illusion of generational wealth and country club elitism. When the federal indictments became public record, the high society circles of Kansas City severed all ties with the Rodriguez family instantly. The wealthy real estate developer, whose son Isabella was aggressively pursuing, recognized the highly toxic nature of the criminal scandal. His family demanded an immediate and permanent separation. Isabella was unceremoniously dropped. She was completely cut off from the stolen funds that financed her designer wardrobe and her superficial lifestyle. She was forced to vacate her expensive downtown apartment and face the terrifying reality of securing minimum wage employment just to survive the winter. My professional name was entirely cleared of all wrongdoing. The regional director of the Federal Compliance Board issued a formal letter of exoneration, citing my instrumental role in dismantling a highly sophisticated corporate fraud ring. The executive board at First National Commerce Bank reviewed the complete evidentiary file. They recognized the gross negligence displayed during my initial suspension. The human resources director, who had mishandled the anonymous extortion email, was terminated immediately for failing to follow proper investigative protocols. The bank reinstated my credentials with full honors. Recognizing my ability to navigate high-stakes financial combat, the executive committee offered me a substantial promotion. I accepted the position of senior commercial portfolio manager. The probate litigation regarding my biological inheritance concluded without any further resistance. With David facing decades in federal prison and his high-priced defense attorneys abandoning him due to unpaid legal fees, the Jackson County judge dissolved the emergency injunction. The St. Louis trust funds transferred smoothly and permanently into my private accounts. The total liquid capital amounted to just over $450,000. Many people who receive a sudden massive influx of cash immediately succumb to the temptation of luxury. They purchase imported sports cars, designer clothing, or extravagant international vacations to compensate for past trauma. I did not engage in any frivolous consumption. I am a commercial loan underwriter. I understand the fundamental difference between depreciating liabilities and generating wealth. I buy tangible assets. I place the entire principal into a diversified, high-yield investment portfolio, securing my financial independence permanently. I resumed my life with a quiet, relentless focus. A full year passed. The chaotic events surrounding the fraudulent bridge loan and the federal indictments faded away into local municipal history. Lucas and I slowly rebuilt our relationship on a new foundation of absolute transparency and mutual respect. We were entirely free from the toxic gravitational pull of my adoptive family. Then, the natural cycle of commerce presented a beautiful, unexpected opportunity. The Plaza Pavilion, the extravagant luxury wedding venue where this entire conflict originally started, suffered a severe financial downturn. Their operating costs exceeded their revenue projections. Their primary commercial mortgage went into critical default. My banking firm absorbed the distressed asset, initiating a comprehensive financial restructuring protocol. Because I was recently promoted to senior portfolio manager, the executive board assigned me as the lead underwriter for the entire Plaza Pavilion account. I was no longer a desperate guest being humiliated and escorted off the premises by private security. I effectively became the absolute financial gatekeeper of the venue. I held full executive authority over their corporate leasing agreements and their event financing approvals. Last Saturday afternoon, the weather in Kansas City was exceptionally mild. Lucas and I decided to visit the property. We ordered espresso from a nearby cafe and walked onto the grand stone terrace overlooking the manicured gardens. The atmosphere was peaceful. We sat at a small wrought iron table, feeling the gentle breeze rustle the leaves of the ancient oak trees. We watched a young couple touring the grounds with an event coordinator. They were planning a future celebration built on genuine affection rather than manufactured social status. I took a slow sip of my coffee, looking out over the sprawling green lawn. I knew my sister was still struggling to navigate the lower economic tiers of the city. I knew Isabella possessed an endless, desperate hunger for public validation. She is currently scouring the metropolitan area looking for a venue to host her next inevitable attempt at a high society wedding. She will undoubtedly try to secure a new line of credit to finance a lavish reception she cannot possibly afford. Eventually, she will submit a financing application to the Plaza Pavilion. That digital file will travel through the automated commercial banking network. It will bypass the junior analysts and route directly into the senior portfolio management queue. It will land squarely on my polished mahogany desk. I will review the massive income discrepancy. I will analyze the fractured credit history. I will look at the applicant name printed clearly at the top of the standardized form. I will not feel anger, resentment, or a lingering desire for dramatic vengeance. I will simply pick up my red ink pen, apply the heavy administrative stamp to the bottom of the page, and quietly mark the application as denied. The ledger is closed. We often look at the manicured lawns, the towering oak trees, and the sprawling driveways of the American suburbs and assume that the homes behind them are absolute sanctuaries of unconditional love. We are culturally conditioned to believe that within those pristine walls, traditional family values are being quietly and faithfully passed down from one generation to the next. We picture a steady foundation built on honesty, fairness, and a deep-seated responsibility to nurture the minds and souls of children. But Naama's harrowing journey strips away the polished, high society veneer of the Rodriguez family to reveal a chilling universal truth. A house constructed on a foundation of hidden ledgers, transactional affection, and emotional manipulation is never truly a home. It is a beautifully decorated cage. When we reflect on the spectacular collapse of David and Helen, we are forced to look beyond the immediate thrill of corporate revenge and examine the profound moral failures that led them to their ruin. At its absolute core, this is not just a story about a forged commercial bridge loan or a stolen biological inheritance. It is a tragic, cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of corrupting the sacred duty of parenthood. Raising a child, whether biological or adopted, is supposed to represent the highest form of human empathy. It is a lifelong commitment to guiding a fragile life into the world with integrity. David and Helen took that sacred duty and mutated it into a cold, calculated revenue stream, viewing a human being not as a daughter to be cherished, but as a depreciating asset to be managed. The true tragedy of the Rodriguez household was the absolute absence of emotional awareness. In a healthy, traditional family structure, parents serve as the emotional shock absorbers for their children, providing a safe harbor where mistakes are met with guidance and love is never treated as a commodity. Helen's homemade chicken enchiladas remain one of the most haunting symbols in Naama's story. They were not a gesture of maternal warmth, they were the currency of conditional approval. When parents weaponize their affection, rewarding children only when they perform, achieve, or alleviate a financial burden, they strip away the child's intrinsic worth. They teach the child that love must be purchased, a lesson that can permanently fracture a young person's ability to trust the world around them. Furthermore, this narrative serves as a stark reminder of the vital importance of fairness in child-rearing. The dichotomy between Naama and her sister Isabella perfectly illustrates the dual destruction caused by parental favoritism. While Naama was subjected to systemic emotional and financial starvation, forced to work grueling dinner shifts to finance a life the state was already subsidizing, Isabella was smothered in unearned luxury and artificial praise. Neither child was properly guided. Naama was forced to become a hardened, cynical auditor of her own life just to survive, while Isabella was crippled by entitlement, entirely incapable of standing on her own 2 feet when the stolen funds dried up. True fairness in parenting does not mean giving children exactly the same material possessions. It means offering them an equal measure of honesty, respect, and preparation for the harsh realities of adulthood. David and Helen failed both of their daughters spectacularly, ensuring one became a predator's target and the other became a fragile, helpless dependent. The American cultural ideal places a heavy emphasis on self-reliance, independence, and the value of a hard-earned dollar. Parents across the country strive to instill these virtues in their children, hoping to launch them into society as capable, resilient adults. David twisted this noble cultural ethos into a weapon of profound abuse. He lectured Naama about building character through manual labor, while he secretly claimed her vehicle as a corporate tax deduction and pocketed her state care stipends. This grotesque hypocrisy highlights a critical parenting lesson you cannot teach a child: integrity if you are fundamentally lacking it yourself. Children are incredibly perceptive. They do not merely listen to the lectures their parents deliver at the kitchen table. They observe the quiet choices their parents make when they believe no one is watching. Long-term guidance requires a parent to embody the very virtues they wish to pass down. When a parent's words preach responsibility, but their actions scream of greed, the child is left to navigate a morally bankrupt landscape. Naama's ultimate triumph was not just about securing her grandmother's $400,000 trust fund or maintaining her prestigious underwriting license. Her true victory was breaking the cycle of generational manipulation. She refused to sign the non-disclosure agreement. She refused to accept a comfortable settlement that would have required her to turn a blind eye to decades of systemic corruption. By rejecting the easy way out and forwarding the evidence to the authorities, she proved that her moral compass survived the toxic environment that attempted to crush it. She took the analytical, emotionally detached survival skills forced upon her by her adoptive parents and used them to dismantle their empire of lies. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, proving that while parents shape our beginnings, they do not have to dictate our endings. Stories like Naama's resonate so deeply because they tap into our most fundamental fears and hopes about family trust and the invisible debts we carry with us. They remind us that the ledgers we keep in life should never be used to tally the cost of loving someone. If you find yourself captivated by narratives that explore the complex, often dark intersections of family dynamics, personal justice, and the triumph of truth over manipulation, we invite you to become a part of our community. Please follow the channel Morning Revenge for more gripping, emotionally resonant stories that explore the incredible lengths people will go to in order to reclaim their stolen lives and rewrite their own destinies. As we close the book on the Rodriguez family, we are left with a lingering, uncomfortable silence. We watch Naama sitting on the terrace of the Plaza Pavilion, quietly holding the power to deny the sister who tormented her, realizing that the scales of justice eventually balance themselves in the most unexpected ways. But the story also turns a mirror toward us, asking a quiet, demanding question about the foundations of our own relationships. Are the bonds we share with our loved ones built on a bedrock of genuine, unconditional support, or are they held together by invisible strings of expectation and obligation? When the final audit of our lives is eventually conducted, long after the manicured lawns have faded and the suburban facades have crumbled, what will the ledgers of our own hearts reveal to